Hi everyone, this is the Module 9 wrap up, coming close to the end of the semester now. So we spent um, a lot of time on the approaches, and now what we get to do, beginning I think Module 9, is to start to apply some of that, start to sort of take our own approach to some of the problems that exist, some of the problems of international relations with these approaches that we've discussed, try us to tackle. In past iterations of this class, actually, I haven't used these sorts of readings, right? Sorts of readings that deal with terrorism, international law, ethno-nationalism. But I am doing it these days. I did it last semester. I'm doing it now. So definitely interested to hear what you have to say about this. But and that's actually why there's none of those old lectures for this one. There are old in the videos at the bottom of the modules page. There are some old sort of module wrap-ups where I've answered clarification questions along the same lines, so you might want to see those, but there isn't the old sort of lecture style, because that's I never got to this point. We spent all of our time on other things. So I've increased the workload a little bit. I've increased the reading. So anyway, here we are. We're talking about terrorism. As Daniel Green puts it, an introductory look into terrorism. I think that's a nice way of describing it. We are going to answer three questions. The three most popular ones are Gregory Estrada Burgada's question. Got 10 upvotes. Daniel Green's got 8, and so did Paco LeBaron. And so we're gonna deal with those three questions straight away. All right. The first one is this. It's from Gregory Estrada Burgada. And he asks, on page 125, Kidd and Walter mentioned that because talk is cheap, states and terrorist groups who wish to influence the behavior of an adversary must resort to signals. Many of these costly signals come in ways of military force or military presence. Yes, looking at how much the US spends on its military budget, could it be said that this signal is not necessarily directed to one adversary, but multiple around the world? Great, let's deal with this a little bit. I think that you have, Gregory, sort of encapsulated the main point, I think, of this reading, right? Is that terrorism, what is terrorism? They do have a nice definition in there in terms of having a political goal and that sort of thing. But I think on a more fundamental level, right? Terrorism is about costly signaling. Talk is cheap. Any group can get together and demand things and say, if you don't do what we want you to do, if you don't change that policy, if you don't change that law, if you don't allow us to have more independence, our own parliament, right, our own government, then we will hurt you, right? We will kill you. We will withhold our labor from you. We will disrupt your peace. We'll disrupt the markets. We'll disrupt the sports events, and whatever it may be. Concerts. Anybody can say that. Talk is cheap, right? Anybody could say that. And so governments, because let's focus on, we are going to talk about states in a second, but really the focus of this is non-governmental actors usually, right? I think Kidd and Walter, if I remember correctly, they preclude us talking about states, really. They say, right, it's a non-state actor. And I think it's worth so bearing that in mind, right? At the beginning, although I do want to get to the question because I think it's a good one. So yeah, non-governmental organizations, non-governmental groups are taking on governments oftentimes. I think, at least according to Kidd and Walter, that's who they're thinking of when they think of terrorists. So in that sort of a relationship where you've got a nation state that collects taxes, that's established, that has military, it's very difficult then for a non-state actor, a group that doesn't collect a lot of taxes, right? That doesn't have an established military, that doesn't have relationships around the world with other states, more powerful than itself, perhaps. It doesn't have a police force, right? It doesn't have any way to force people, right? To use violence to force people to do what they want. Well, it's then you're in a different relationship, right? Two states might negotiate as equals, perhaps, or rough equals, depending on their relative power. But a non-state actor is almost always going to be in a much weaker position than the state. And so just threatening a state, right, and just telling it, hey, if you don't do what we tell you to do, then there'll be trouble. Well, one, it's not very effective, but two, one of the reasons it's not effective is because anybody can do that, right? I could do that. I could set up a YouTube channel and start demanding all sorts of things, right? It's very cheap to do. Of course, depending on the way I phrase my demands, right, it might not be so cheap. I might end up in prison, depending on the sorts of threats that I make, right, and the sorts of views that I advocate. So it's not completely without cost, but it's relatively cheap, right? You could do it, right? Anybody could do it. So states shouldn't really listen to those groups, right? They shouldn't really. I mean, maybe they could sort of give them an ear, right? They could hear them out, perhaps, right? In a liberal democracy, we believe in having a diversity of views, and we sort of are open to listening to diverse views, and so maybe a state should listen. But there's nothing that should force a state to give into those demands, right? Because like I said, otherwise they'd have to give new demands every day. They'd have to give into all sorts of demands, and we'd be in all sorts of interesting scenarios and situations. So they can't listen to that. And so in order to be heard, right, in order to signal, to get that signal out, right, strongly, now you've got to start engaging in action, right? And for terrorists, right, what's the action that gets them noticed, that gets them an ear? It ends up probably being violent, or maybe it starts off not non-violent resistance, right? Maybe the sort of protests and that sort of thing. But ultimately, especially if you are a particularly unpopular group, right, a group that's maybe outlawed, then you end up taking bigger and bigger risks to make your action more expensive. It's one thing to set up a YouTube channel and talk. It's one thing to write a letter to your congressman, but it makes it much more expensive for you, thankfully, right, to start engaging in violence. And the bigger the violent acts, the more disruptive the violent acts, the bigger cost that you are saying, look, this is how serious I am, right? This is how serious I am. This is what I'm willing to do. This is what I'm willing to undergo. So that's the sort of the logic behind terrorism and terrorist groups. And I think Kidd and Walter, they mentioned that this is not completely unsuccessful strategy, right? This has been employed by many groups, and there's some success and there's some failures. Right? So that's the incentive for that, right? So it's a costly signal. We have to, we're saying military force and military presence in the question. I want to distinguish, and we will do this more, I think, when we talk about what we'll talk about in the next module, when we start talking about guerrilla forces. But I definitely want to distinguish the military from terrorists, right? I think it's not necessarily military force, but it is violence, right? The military use violence, but it's not. But violence isn't the definition of the military, right? Military has to do with organized groups that are connected to nation states, that are sort of underpinned, they're sponsored by nation states, that are raised by nation states, right? Terrorists are quite a different kettle of fish usually, right? Usually any formal training they have as terrorists, right? I mean, it's usually informal, right? It's usually not formal. It's usually the discipline, the organization, right? The openness, right, is quite different. So I do want to separate those two things, while recognizing that, yes, military force, right, the military is ultimately there to use violence in order to either to protect, let's say just to protect the foreign policy of a nation state. So yes, it is there to use violence, and yes, terrorists are going to use costly signals in the form of violence usually. But I think I think I'd like to keep them separate for reasons that, again, we'll talk about in the next module. So, so many of these costly signals come in ways of military force. I would say, let's not say military force for terrorism, let's say violence, you know, or the threat of violence, right? Perhaps a military presence. Looking at now how much the US spends on its military budget, could this, we said the signal is not necessarily directed at one adversary, but multiple around the world. And I like this, right? I haven't thought about it quite in this way before. You know, I thought about it, well, yes, violence and violence, okay, I see there's some sort of a correspondence there. When we talk about guerrilla forces, as we will next time, we'll talk about sort of an evolution from terrorist to guerrilla force to military, right, to state around military. And there is a, in history, there's been a progression, right, as nation states become established. So, so yes, you know, there is that connection, but I've never seen quite this connection before. And I like it because it's the same and different. With terrorists, usually they don't have a lot of money. We're talking about a military budget here, right? So terrorists, usually they don't have a lot of resources in the same way that a state has a lot of resources. They usually have much less of a budget, right? Much smaller budget. And so actually their costly signaling, the way that they incur cost to themselves, right? The way that they show what costs they're prepared to bear is by, you know, going to prison, getting killed by the police, getting killed perhaps by military forces, and killing, right? And killing soft targets, usually blowing up important buildings and all that sort of a thing, right? So I see the difference I see there is, well, let's say the similarity that I see that you're pointing out to me is that they both are signaling, right? And they both are doing something other than just talking, right? The United States is not just getting on the UN stage and saying, hey guys, don't mess with us, or we'll, you know, they're not just making idle threats, right? They're showing that they're willing to incur costs that ultimately back, and military force for the United States, I think, and for probably every other country, because it's quite costly, is a very last resort, right? I'm not saying that they go around threatening military force at the drop of a hat, but ultimately, right, if I take what you're saying, the fact that we're spending so much on our military gives a message, a costly signal, right, to the rest of the world that, look, ultimately our foreign policy is ultimately backed up by such overwhelming and such technologically advanced, such impressive military force, well-trained personnel, that, you know, you should listen to us, right? And it's not just talk, right? We've spent all this money, all these many billions, and we continue to spend all these many billions, right? And so that's a different way of doing costly signaling. And in fact, I hadn't really thought about it as costly signaling until you mentioned it, than a terrorist organization that really has to, you know, blow up a bus or something like that, right? Because they, you know, nobody's going to listen to them because they haven't got a huge military. They haven't got the United States military budget, right? They haven't got even the French military budget, right? Or the Turkish military budget, or the, you know, or even the Vietnamese military budget, I imagine, right? So, yes. And that's, so I think it's a different kind of costly signaling. And that's, again, interestingly, not, now that I'm talking about it, now that I'm considering what you're saying, it's not that they don't also, the US don't also engage in the other kind of costly signaling, right? The actual use of that force, you know, which might involve something as I remember when I was in graduate school, I was writing a paper about this, about the Turkish invasion of Cyprus in 1974, and particularly about the American response to it. And one of the things, I think the thing that I focused really closely on, one of the things that interested me a lot is, at the time that the Turks invaded Cyprus in 1974, there was a US aircraft carrier, and it was leaving the Mediterranean. It had done a tour of the Mediterranean, and it was on its way out. And at the point of invasion, the aircraft carrier, I can't remember the name of it now, but it might come back to me because it was a strong focus. The aircraft carrier was to the, or what do you call that? To Gibraltar, basically, right? What do you call the pillars? You know, it's Atlas, right? Where he all holds up the air. Anyway, it was almost to there. It was on its way back out of the Mediterranean. And I read the notes from this meeting, right, with the president. I think it was President Ford at the time. I'm trying to remember now, but the president and his National Security Council, I think, are in there, and they're talking about what do we do with this aircraft carrier. Right? Whatever we do, if we start to send it back towards Cyprus, that's a signal, right? If we let it carry on its course, right, which is to return, I think to return to the US, right? Quite a long way. I don't know. Maybe the 70s are different than the 2000s, but I think it's on its way. But if we let it return, then we're also giving a signal, right? If we send it back, we're saying, hey, we're angry at Turkey and we're threatening. That's a threatening move, a threatening signal to Turkey. If we allow it just to carry on its scheduled journey, then we're saying, hey, we don't care what Turkey has done in terms of invasion of Cyprus. And it's interesting to see the discussion of what they should do. And I think in the end they decide, let's just halt it exactly where it is. Right? That I think the thinking was that that's the least strong signal. And so in the case of the United States military, right, I think it's almost hard not to make a strong signal. For the terrorists, it's hard to make a strong signal, right, because they don't have the resources. But when you've got aircraft carriers, and when you're the United States, right, when you're the most powerful country in the world, I mean, this is still during the Cold War. There's also the Soviet Union there, but when you're certainly one of the superpowers, one of the two superpowers, then it's impossible not to make a signal. But that should really again emphasize the distinction between nation states, especially powerful ones like the United States, and terrorist organizations. The terrorist groups have a much harder time of being noticed and being recognized than the United States of America does. So yeah, I definitely like that. I like that spending, right, actually incurring economic cost to add strength to your signals rather than engage in military force. Right, I think I just talked about the aircraft carrier, just a matter of which direction it was headed. That was enough to be a powerful signal to Turkey, right, and to Greece, who were also involved, and to Cyprus, and to the British, who were marginally involved, right, and probably to the Soviet Union as well, with whom we were locked in a competition. But think of, there's probably more costly signals. Another one that comes to my mind, and you'll pick up a theme here. I'm very interested in Southeast Europe, in the Balkans, and so the Cyprus example, and then the other example that comes straight to my mind is the NATO bombing of Belgrade during the Kosovo War, I suppose, right, where we were telling Milosevic, that NATO, the United States in particular, right, was telling Milosevic, hey, we don't want you to fight this war over Kosovo. Hey, we don't want you to fight this war in this particular way. Stop it, stop it, stop it. Was it Milosevic by then? Yeah, it was still Milosevic. He ignored because talk is cheap. So even when you are backed up with the military might, there's also another question of, well, are they really serious about it, right? So maybe it's not as easy as I'm letting on. So Milosevic ignores it. And so to sort of costly, to up the signal a little bit, right? Up the strength of the signal and to incur some costs, we did airstrikes on the capital city of Serbia, Belgrade, the capital of Yugoslavia at the time, Yugoslavia and Serbia. But the Yugoslavia at that point was just Serbia, I think, and Montenegro. The other republics had declared independence. We bombed the Yugoslav capital. I think ended up bombing a Chinese embassy during one of those raids. And another one of those raids, we flattened the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Yugoslavia. I think a bridge as well there. Now that cost us, right? That cost us, not just certainly economically in terms of the bombs. One of the planes was shot down. One of the pilots captured, I think. I don't know if he was killed or captured, but certainly one of the planes were shot down. So that was cost us in that way. It cost us in the bombs. Right? It cost us also it made some damage to our relationship, right, with China, because we bombed the embassy. Right, that was a mistake, obviously. So we incurred these costs again to up the strength of the signal that we wanted to send, and that's pretty strong, pretty strong signal. And look at the options that the United States has as a nation state. Look at the options that the terrorists don't really have. Right? There's not going to be fighter bomber planes that terrorists are going to use to make their signals. Right? It's very different. All right. I think that's a great discussion on costly signaling. Some examples there, some concrete examples. Thanks, Gregory, for that question. It was a very good one. Second one then, Daniel Green, the Kidd and Walter article presents an introductory look into terrorism. I already quoted that, I like that. They described what ways terrorism would be used and how terrorist organizations would be either unsuccessful or successful depending on the location of the cause. They base their analysis on the assumption that terrorists are rational actors with an end goal in mind and a political objective to achieve. Okay, what about a non-rational actor such as a terrorist group that does not want political change, just the death of an opposing people group? Right? People, I think, is fine, or group, either way. How would that be explained? So, I think, so for me, I like this question as well. I like it. It's definitely one that I've given some thought to, and I seem to be against the prevailing wind, at least the prevailing wind in like the media, right? Terrorists oftentimes, I think, in the media are portrayed, the mass media, I mean, including sort of news types things, and also, you know, fiction films and series and that sort of thing. Oftentimes, and to be honest, like by other politicians, right? By other by political leaders, right? And we'll talk a little bit about why that might be the case, I think. But so they're often portrayed as irrational, right? Irrational actors. I think I've been convinced in my reading and in my classes from graduate school, and by just talking to people, I've been convinced that they're not irrational actors. The terrorist groups are not just sort of randomly and for no reason going out and killing people. Now, I'm not trying to justify it, right? I certainly think that terrorist acts are almost never justified, right? And I think that's part of the label terrorism, right? Because otherwise we might give them another label, right? And we might talk about that a little bit more as well when we talk about guerrilla groups as well. So, yeah, terrorist groups are not non-rational. One of the first piece of sort of evidence I'll use to back myself up is if I remember studying Al Qaeda, and this is a little bit ago now, right? Because obviously we don't talk a ton about Al Qaeda these days. We talk more about ISIS, and even that now is going by. But you know, one of the studies that I read about Al Qaeda, one of the points that was trying to make is that, look, these people are not just sort of down and out. They can't find the unemployable, uneducated people who are just easily led. Right? That wasn't the profile. In fact, what they found was that Al Qaeda, people who joined Al Qaeda, people who got involved in Al Qaeda, it was almost like applying for a job, in the sense that Al Qaeda had a lot of choice, right? And they were picking the most educated and the best qualified people, right? A lot of times in the Middle East, there's a lot of educated people, a lot of like engineers, engineering in particular, it seems like. A lot of engineers and not enough jobs. So you have all these very educated people who are now without jobs and not achieving the sort of life that they expected. And they're looking for some reason for that, right? And some explanation of that. Right? And so Al Qaeda comes along and says, well, we're being oppressed by the West, right? The Americans. They're oppressing us. They're oppressing us Muslims here in the Holy Land, and that's why that's the reason why you're economically disadvantaged despite your high level of education. And so, and Al Qaeda had that choice of people, right? These educated people were lining up to join in, right, and to get involved. Now, I don't want to insinuate that all engineers in the Middle East are Al Qaeda operatives. Of course, that's not. But there was enough that Al Qaeda could pick and choose. Right? They could pick and choose the best. And so they're educated. They have grievances, legitimate, obvious grievances in terms of in terms of rational actor type grievances, right? About economics. Right? People want to be economically successful, and so if they're not, then they're going to try and find reasons why they're not. And if you're trying to find reasons why you're not and trying to address those reasons, right, and trying to address those issues, then that's rational, right? That's what rational is. Now, they might get the calculations wrong, right, and they might be based on faulty information, but faulty information or maybe even bad reasoning doesn't mean that there's not some sort of rational choice going on, right? Some rational, and some sort of objective, even a political objective. Right? I think if you are just engaged in random acts of indiscriminate killing for no discernible reason, and that's, then you're probably not a terrorist at that point. You're probably just a mass murderer. You're probably a crazy person, right? You probably have serious. I'm not even sure that I can, because even if your reasoning is a little bit faulty, right? Even if you're not thinking properly, right, and you're making really bad decisions, there's still some sort of rationale there, right? And I want to sort of develop this by going on to talk about, what if they don't want political change, just the death of an opposing people group? I think that death of an opposing people group, it's evil, but it's rational, right? It's not that it's it's a reason, right? It's a goal. It's a political goal. It's not a political goal that's genocide is of, but genocide is a political goal. It's a heinous one. But it is a one, right? It's a political goal, and so maybe there's something here in because you're comparing political change. You're saying they don't want political change, but they want the death of an opposing people group. This is actually making me think of Ahmadinejad, right? When he stands up as in Iran and he says, "We're going to kill all of the Jews, right? We're going to kill all of the, we're going to drive all the Israelis into the sea." And that sounds to you and me, that sounds crazy, and it is a little bit crazy. But it's still a political goal, and the reason that, for me, right, the reason, and I'll get into some other reasons now why I think that this is still rational. He's not saying that necessarily because he intends to do that. That would be not only evil, but it would also be is the undoing of Iran, right? That would be the end of Iran then, complete end of Iran, if they attempted that. So it would not be rational to do that, right? It wouldn't be rational to do that. If they did that, then I would say, okay, yeah, you're right, actually, this is irrational. But it's not irrational to say that, right? That amongst certain groups, right, amongst the political supporters of Ahmadinejad, that garners him support. And so, and here's where I'm coming into rational now, right? So it might be rational, if you're a political leader, you probably want to remain a political leader, you probably want to stay a political leader. And so part of that is having the support of the population, even if it's not a super liberal democracy. You still, even dictators need the support of the people. Nobody can oppose everybody. And so, not that I'm disparaging the democracy in Iran, but so Ahmadinejad, it's rational if he wants to stay in power. It's rational from that garner support, and so to say these sort of very outlandish sorts of things that does, it makes sense to say them. It doesn't make sense to try and do them, because if you try and do them, then that's the end of Iran. That's the end of you, right? You're no longer going to be the leader of Iran anymore, right? Because you're going to face insurmountable opposition, probably from inside of your own country, the people who are horrified by that and think, horrified by the act. Some of the people who think this is going to get us all destroyed, right, by the Americans, and the whole international community, and the Israelis themselves, who have nuclear weapons, of course. So that wouldn't be rational to try and do it, because he would remove himself from power. Leaders like to hang on to power, and so that might be slightly less true for terrorists, right, where they don't have as much to lose, right? But again, the death of an opposing people group, that's, again, it's hard to get to grips with that. It's certainly different in terms of political change, right? It's not just the same as changing a law, right, and having, oh, let's have same-sex marriage legal in all 50 states, or let's not have it. I mean, that's fairly serious, but it's not the same. I understand that death of an entire people is different from even quite important political issues. But I think I'm saying it's different, but I think it is just it's just a much more radical, much more disruptive, much more certainly, like, if we go back 100 years, right, to the early 1900s in the Balkans again, I feel safe in the Balkans, let's say, when I'm discussing these things. If we go to the Balkans, the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, we'll see a lot of population exchanges. We'll see a lot of ethnic cleansing before ethnic cleansing really becomes a thing in the English language. We have ethnic cleansing. We have, and I think mostly between Greece and Turkey, right? I think that the Treaty of Lausanne in 1922, early 1920s, I'm going to say. Maybe I'm even wrong about that. Who knows? Anyway, they sign a treaty. The Greeks have tried to get to Constantinople. They failed. They've been driven back. Both sides, the Greeks going towards Constantinople, and then the Turks pushing back out away from Constantinople. On the way there, they're burning villages. The Greeks are burning Turkish villages, right, and then the Turks are burning Greek villages and cities and towns, Smyrna, Izmir, as the Turks call it, right? To deliberately to drive those people out and even to kill those people. It was a much more common political goal, right, in those days. And the Treaty of Lausanne, what it did is it agreed peacefully, okay, we're going to, all of the Christians that are living, the Greek-speaking Christians that are living in Turkish-occupied territory now, and we're going to take them in our current borders of Greece, right, away from Constantinople, away from around the Asia Minor, from around the coast. We're going to take them all back. We're going to take them all in, right, because they've never lived in that part of Greece before. That the Asia Minor was their home, right? So they're going to come here, and then all of the Muslims that we have here in what is now Greek territory, we're going to send over to you guys, right? And so they exchange that. So it's political, right? It's still a political end. So in a nutshell, then, to sum up my answer to that is that I think that the terrorist groups are rational. They have political goals. If they're not rational and don't have political goals, then I think it's hard to talk about them as terrorists in the sort of academic sense of the word, personally. And again, I think it can be rational for certain political leaders to call for these things, not that it's a good thing to do, but that it garners them some support from hardliners, and it's talking big in front of your friends. So I think I'm bigging yourself up and helping you to hold on to power. But it certainly wouldn't be rational if they actually went ahead and did that. That would be the end of, like I said, the end of Iran, the end of certainly any Iranian regime that would do that. But for a terrorist group, it would be still a political goal, but it might be something that they feel that because they have less to lose, right? Because it's one thing to destroy Iran and to do a regime change in Iran, but terrorists are already at war, right? Terrorists are already the object of concern for the international community. The international community is already doing drone strikes and killing their leaders, right? So they're already there. So there's nothing further maybe to lose on trying to carry out those policies, but of course they don't have the means to really do that, and they have political reasons perhaps for doing it. All right, Kidd and Walter. This is Parker LeBaron. Kidd and Walter efficiently explained the terror strategies. We haven't talked at all about the individual terror strategies. Let me say, definitely, and I think they do a good job of explaining them, but definitely know what those strategies are. If you're going to talk about them in your paper, you really do talk about those strategies. Take something, because I mean, that's the meat of the article, and we haven't really discussed it too much here. Kidd and Walter efficiently explained that terror strategies and possible rebukes and responses against them. However, little to no examples were provided from American responses to terrorism, except the failed examples in Vietnam. Are there any examples that resulted in success, or has America always struggled in combating terror? And it's hard to say for America. So I don't know American history quite as well as I know British history, for example. And I'm about to give you an example from British history that I think we also get if we didn't get in this one, we're going to get in the next one, in the guerrillas one, because I mean, it's fairly, America's involvement and strategies against terrorism is fairly recent. The thing with the British is we had this empire back in the 19th century where all of the parts of the empire ultimately rose up against British rule, and so we were fighting guerrilla warfare. We were fighting terrorists all over the world, right, for 100 years, right, and eventually they all beat us, right, which is why we now no longer have and I think there's an example here of, I think don't Kidd and Walter talk about Cyprus, I think, or is it this one and the guerrilla one? We're going to get mixed up. I get them mixed up. Anyway, so Cyprus, India, I mean, anywhere the British were, there were these uprisings, and so there's more of a history. And the classic example of successful ways of dealing with terrorism. One of the big lessons is the Malaysia one, right, where the British were fighting an insurgency there in Malaysia. And one of the things about terrorism is that, and guerrillas as well, as we'll learn later, is that because they're not military, right, because they're not wearing a uniform, because they're not organized, because they don't have bases that are fairly, big installations that are public knowledge about where they are. And because they don't wear uniforms, because they don't line up in formations, and because they don't train together in well-known places where they're known to train. When they do, like in Afghanistan, those bases get destroyed. Right? So they don't usually do that. But because they do all these things, they're hard to distinguish from normal civilians. And so this is one of the things that makes terrorists difficult to enact. So in Malaysia, I'm thinking over the question again as I'm saying it, because I'm also thinking of some advice that they give, that Kidd and Walter give, right? But you say that, right? Possible rebukes and responses against them, right? So there is some of that in there. So if anybody else didn't catch that, do go back and have a look at that. But this is an example of not America but Britain, but actually the Americans do learn a lesson from it. General Petraeus uses the tactics to some extent. Anyway, but it's this hearts and minds strategy. But in Malaysia, the way that they did it was, in order to separate the good guys from the bad guys, they built these villages. The British built villages with good infrastructure and that sort of thing. They said, okay, come and live in the village, right? We built these for you, come on inside. And they figured that the ones that came inside were probably not the terrorists, right? Because, these are British built villages, and also, the Britain is supplying the security in there, right? So it's swarming with British soldiers, with British security forces that are in charge in these villages. And so if you go there and you're a terrorist, you have a good chance of being caught. And so terrorists usually didn't go there, they stayed up in the mountains, and the non-terrorists came down. And so then one thing that deprived the terrorists, the insurgents, of their support, right, from local infrastructure, local villages with their farms and that sort of thing. But the other thing, it isolated them, right? It made the terrorists easier to spot. If you're up there in the mountains, the likelihood is, because we have a much better offer down here, if you're not taking us up on that offer, you're probably an enemy, right? So that was one way, and it's sort of a hearts and minds way, and it's separate them from the outside of the civilian population. And it's something that General Petraeus builds on during the Iraq and Afghanistan, in Iraq during the insurgency there. So, but having said that, right, the last part of the question, Parker, is, or has America always struggled with combating terror? And again, I think the American history with terror is fairly recent, right? It goes back, not to say, it goes back to 9/11, really. Right. Of course, there were those plane hijackings and things like that before, but terrorism, as we think of it today, it goes back to 9/11 for the Americans. I don't know how, again, American history in the Philippines, right, in the 19th century, what that looked like exactly, but I do know that. Where the British were, there was uprisings, and ultimately, I mean, it was always a struggle for Britain, to the point where, in a lot of cases they said, well, this is too costly, right? There's no point. The costs outweigh the benefits. We're off, and that's what happened in Cyprus, for example. So yeah, I think it's always difficult for any power to combat terror, and why, right? One of the reasons, and they talk about this, the attrition. Who governs Cyprus is much more important to the Cypriots than it is to the British. Right? Cyprus is great and all. There's all sorts of advantages with it. In fact, the British, well, what did the British do? They left, but they kept a base there, right? Because it's great for bases. Britain's always been, it's always been important to Britain in history to control the Eastern Mediterranean, right? And Greece has been an ally of Britain in that. And the Suez Canal and with the French, and Cyprus, right, was sort of a place to park your ships, right, and your soldiers to help control the Eastern Mediterranean. So yeah, and what did Britain do? They said, okay, you govern yourselves, but just give us a little strip of land here. And so the British still operate, and technically it's British sovereign territory on Cyprus, a small, well, it's a big base, but it's a small part of the island, similar to Guantanamo Bay, I suppose. We have that base on the island, and that's all we really wanted anyway. And so, yeah, go on, take the rest of you govern the rest of the island, just leave us a base. Right? But it's much more important to local people usually, right, than it is to the foreign powers, except for the fact that they want a base. But if they have a base anyway, then why carry on fighting? Right? What's the benefit? So yes, I imagine that it's always going to be difficult for that reason, among many, to really even for big powers to combat small terrorist uprisings or insurgencies.